Today's events grew out of a response to School District 271 controversy over the Impressions series textbooks. And those of us here in the English department at North Idaho College found that we were of two minds over the issue ourselves. We couldn't agree on the distinction between textbook selection and textbook censorship. Two questions seem to be at the core of our discussion. To what extent do community values enter into the content of education? And second, who makes the decisions regarding what a student's right to know is? So with those two things in mind, we realized that we needed to study and to reflect, and more specifically, we wanted to hear from an authority, and we wanted to listen to the dialogue of conflicting voices, thus convocations. Shortly, we'll hear from the authority. This evening at 7 p.m. in the Bonner Room, we'll listen to the discussion, the dialogue of varying viewpoints. The Convocations Committee for this evening has brought together a panel of varying viewpoints to discuss a hypothetical situation. And the scenario for this evening's panel involves a high school literature text containing passages objectionable to a student and to her parents. Mr. Hentoff will be part of that panel along with a high school student, some parents, some school personnel, and some community representatives. So you're all invited. Copies of the hypothetical situation will be available in the library after Mr. Hentoff's presentation, where there will be coffee and conversation with Hentoff. So you're invited to come for a more informal question and answer session in the library with coffee and punch and cookies. The scenario for this evening's panel will be available there. Now, to our authority. Mr. Hentoff is a journalist, a novelist, a wide-ranging social critic, a self-described advocacy writer, and according to current biography, an uncompromising civil libertarian, one of the most vocal of First Amendment purists. Reviewers of his books have called him, quote, a kindly provocateur, a sentimental rationalist, an enemy of humbug who forgives sinners, and one of the great true blue jazz-loving freedom fighters of our time. Mr. Hentoff has written several books on jazz. He currently writes for The Village Voice and The New Yorker, among others. His novels for both adults and young adults deal with race relations and with educational issues. When we looked for an authority for our Convocations Day, we made some calls. One call was to a National Librarians Association in the Midwest, and the other call was to an attorney in the U.S. Department of Education. And we asked for recommendations. Who would you suggest? At the top of both lists was Mr. Hentoff. So we're very fortunate to have him. Please welcome Mr. Nat Hentoff.
I'm going to leave as much time as any of you would like for questions and denunciations. It's always, I think, a lot of fun to denounce authorities. The reference to community values, that is usually what school boards in court cases use as their main argument. I remember watching the oral arguments in the Supreme Court in the Allen Trees case, and they say, we have to, as elected officials, we have to inculcate community values. And I wish the lawyer on the other side had asked the question, well, what if the values of the community are overwhelmingly racist? There are such places. Or anti-Semitic, or anti-Catholic, or sexist. Or suppose the community values were such that there was an abiding hatred of all things capital R Republican. Nothing of the Republican Party could be in the schools. I wonder how many school boards would then use the shield of community values. Over the last dozen years or so, there have been a good many reports financed by prestigious foundations and other institutions on what's wrong with the schools, what's wrong with American education. Some of the conclusions are accurate and obvious. There are certainly deficiencies in reading, in math, in writing. I used to teach graduate courses in college. There certainly is a lot wrong with writing. And that's why so many colleges have remedial courses. But few of these reports focus on the deficiencies in students' thinking. That is, do they know mainly what they are told to think, or do they know how to think for themselves? Can they learn this quintessential skill of how to know who they are, what their needs are, what their true interests are, what their potentials are, if they go to a school where they do not have the right to read, to explore their potential? That is, the right to read, the only right to read is that of books that are allowed in the classrooms. Let me tell you about a teacher whom I've gotten to know over the past few years. She succeeded for a time in helping to create a school where kids became enthusiastic about reading and therefore about thinking. They felt deprived if they didn't have books to read. It was that kind of a school. The school was in Florida, in Mowatt, M-O-W-A-T Middle School. And in 1985, because of what this teacher and others had done, it was one of 150 American and Canadian secondary schools designated a Center of Excellence by the National Council of Teachers of English. What they did, among other things, they had libraries in every classroom, math, geography, whatever. Libraries stocked not only by the school, but by books the teachers liked, books the kids liked. And though no one had to read any of those books, they all did. By 1986, and by the way, the reading scores, not surprisingly, went way up. By 1986, the 9th graders at Moab were scoring on the high 12th grade reading level. Then came the affair of I Am the Cheese by Robert Cormier, one of the most honored of young adult books, the 1977 Library of Congress Children's Book of the Year. The book is about a kid whose father, and therefore mother and he himself, are in the Witness Protection Program. It's one of the foulest programs operated by the federal government because it doesn't protect, among other things it doesn't do. Anyway, the new district superintendent, a man named Leonard Hall, didn't like the negative attitude of the book toward government. I Am the Cheese was immediately removed from the curriculum. Superintendent just ignored the usual review procedure when there's a complaint about a book. And then, having the taste for this, he began to cast other books into darkness. One of them, Never Cry Wolf, by wildlife author Farley Mowat. The book is about tracking wolves in the Arctic. That's what it's about. No sex, no witchcraft, just tracking real wolves. One passage has 3 ordinary expletives. A guy gets very frustrated and said, "Oh, Jesus Christ, goddamn," or something like that. But that could pass even today's Federal Communications Commission. Out went the wolves. The following year, the superintendent commanded teachers to closely examine classroom books and separate them into 3 categories. And the first would be books without vulgar, obscene, or sexually explicit material. In the second category would be those with very limited vulgarity and no sexually explicit or obscene material. In the dread third category would be books with quite a bit of vulgarity or obscenity and or sexually explicit material. Quite a bit was not made more specific, nor were any of the other terms in the formula. Teachers, can you imagine this? Teachers in the 2 high schools in the town pored over the books, presented Mr. Hall with 64 titles that by his standards were flagrantly impure. They were in category 3, and he removed them from the reading list. Among the titles, The Red Badge of Courage, Intruders in the Dust, Oedipus Rex, he had a point there, I suppose. The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, a well-known writer of pornographic books, by the way. He was. The Canterbury Tales, John Ciardi's translation of the Inferno, Hamlet, and of course, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which, as you know, is a novel about a future time when the only way to keep certain books alive is to go into hiding and memorize them. The rest are burned. I was once, during most of one year, I did a lot of covering of attempts, some of them successful around the country, to ban Huckleberry Finn, not only from classrooms, but from the schools entirely. And I got to know a very articulate woman in Dallas who was the head of the committee to ban the book. And I asked her if her daughter, and that's where it all started, had been given an alternative book so that she didn't have to read Huckleberry Finn. The mother said yes, but Huckleberry Finn is just too dangerous and too destructive to remain in the curriculum. Well, I said, what was the other book that your daughter was given? Oh, that was a very good book, she said. It was called Fahrenheit 451. Anyway, back to Florida in May of the year that all the books, or most of the books that were extirpated, there was this crowded school board meeting to consider this remarkable new analysis of Western literature, where you can find pornography and obscenity and, Animal Farm, or Oedipus Rex even. At the meeting, students and teachers wore black armbands, and outside the room, a number of the kids held up posters, and the posters said, "Why teach us to read and then say we can't?" The school board put most of the books back into the classroom. You know why? It wasn't they were suddenly struck with the fervor and power of the First Amendment. Like most towns, this town was trying to get new business. And the Chamber of Commerce was furious at what was going on that the superintendent was doing. How, they said to the members of the school board, can you expect us to get companies with young executives with children who would go under our schools and they find out that we're banning Hamlet? But the superintendent is still in office, and he still has the power to remove unclean books. I got a call from the teacher I know, Gloria Pipkin. One afternoon, beginning of the school year, she said, "He knocked off 17 books today, and one of them is yours." The book was The Day They Came to Arrest the Book. The Day They Came to Arrest the Book is about a high school in which Huckleberry Finn is in grave trouble. Wanting to ban him are black parents, are feminists because they say that all the women in Huckleberry Finn are clods, and very religious people parents want to ban the book because Huck turns away from the church and swears and doesn't go to school. What the novel does is set up a series of debates. I try to make them real debates, because that's why the kids, I think, like the book. Both sides have very strong arguments. But as I remember, there wasn't anything pornographic in it. So I asked Gloria, why did he take the book out? Didn't he like the idea of kids debating about this sort of thing? She said, no. You probably don't remember, but in one page of the book, one of the characters says, damn. There's been a class action suit trying to get those books back into the schools. But Gloria now is the only one of that original team of teachers who is still in the school. They got burned out. They got administrative jobs somewhere else. They left teaching. She stays. In fact, she told me that 10 of the 11 women in the English department at its peak have bailed out. She stays. Not too long ago at a meeting of the school board, one of the school board members looked at her. She was there again, trying to get I Am the Cheese back into the classroom and into the school library. And he said, why are you fighting to bring this book back? Why are you fighting so hard? And she looked at him and said, because it's worth it. Superintendent Leonard Hall has professed to be very disturbed at all of this that's been going on to people like Gloria Picken and foes of what they call censorship. He said, you know, all of this talk of children's rights, he said, has distracted them from their studies. It has confused them. I'm not so sure it's confused them, and I'm not so sure the distraction isn't healthy. I want to go, well, one more thing. As a reporter who covers a lot of these battles, it seems to me, and I've felt this for a long time, that the people who are on the front line all the time, fighting attempts to diminish children, diminish what they can read, and therefore diminish their ability to think for themselves. The people on the front line are really teachers and librarians in the public schools and to some extent in the public libraries. It's not only that there are more direct battles going on in those areas, but they have to stay there. If I do a story, I go, I spend 2 or 3 days and I write my piece and then I'm gone. But the librarians and the teachers, they deal with those people who want to purge books every day. Some of them, well, a good many librarians, having said having underlined the nobility of many of them, others engage in a goodly amount of self-censorship. This comes out again and again in polls of librarians in a number of states. Others are very, very confused is the word, conflicted. I went to the Rhode Island School of Library Silence a couple of years ago to speak. And preceding me was a young woman. She had been a librarian. She'd been very active in fighting for the rights of librarians, who in turn were fighting censorship. She had just been appointed to become an editor of the children's section of a very prestigious publishing house. And she did a lot of book reviewing of young adult books. When she began to talk, it was really as if she were speaking to herself, as if we were eavesdropping, because she was in conflict, and that was what she most wanted to talk about. She said, if being true to the First Amendment means that I am free to warp young children's minds in the name of intellectual freedom, is that what I should be doing if I were still a librarian? For example, do I want to encourage young people to adopt the views of the Ku Klux Klan by making available to them a reasonably well-written book that is favorable to the Klan? If that's freedom, maybe we can do with a little less freedom. Okay, she said, maybe I'd have such a book in the library collection if it were non-fiction. Somehow in my own conflict between adherence to freedom and adherence to positive, healthy values for young readers, I feel on safer ground in dealing with nonfiction books. Because with them, you're disseminating information you can always recommend to the young reader other nonfiction books that come at the same subject from wholly different perspectives, like a strong anti-Klan book. Then the reader can sift the information out for himself or herself. But novels, she said, what am I to do about novels? Fiction is dangerous. More readers of whatever age are actually changed by fiction than by nonfiction. I think that's true. I've conducted through the years after hearing her talk very informal, unscientific polls asking people what books that they read in their teens or early 20s most changed them, that are still a durable influence on them. In my own case, when I was 15, I read Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, and that has changed forever my view of politics, of freedom, of liberty, of what happens when people with from their point of view, the most democratic ends, nonetheless use totalitarian means. It's a very, very powerful novel. And other people I've talked to have mentioned other books. One person mentioned the Bible, but he was running for office. So she said, as a librarian, should I keep in the collection or buy for the collection novels that show all women as passive and obedient? Even if those books are very well written, what would I do? What would I do if someone, a radical Catholic pacifist, Dorothy Day, come back from the dead, writes a book in favor of pro-life, against abortion. And she writes powerfully, lyrically, beautifully. I would say, she said, that such a novel is pernicious, especially to adolescents, because it spreads dangerous mischief through the mesmeric power and illusions of fiction. No matter how well written, should I have that novel in the library? And she said, well, and I could see her coming to this conclusion, maybe in that case, a little bit of censorship would be the right thing to do. When she finished, I'd been writing very furiously, because I had decided to scrap my speech and I was going to spend the whole rest of my time talking about her in a very unkindly way. Not too unkindly, but essentially unkindly. But there was a question period first, and a woman in her 50s or so got up, identified herself as a public school librarian, had been at it for many years, and she said to the young woman who had just finished, I want to ask you just one question. I want to be sure I really understand what you're saying. Are you saying that we should put limits on children? Limits on what they read and think and explore so that they'll grow up more free? I had to go back to my original speech. There was nothing I could add to that one. I want to get out of the classroom briefly and talk about something that is of much concern to many people. It was to the former Attorney General, but it's also very mysterious. Potter Stewart, the late Supreme Court Justice, I'm sure you've heard the line, it was in a concurring opinion. He was trying to point out that this particular movie was not hardcore pornography. So then he had to say why. I mean, Supreme Court Justice writing an opinion. He said, well, I can't tell you what it is, what hardcore pornography is, but I know it when I see it. Which is the problem, as Justice Brennan will tell you, who's an expert on all this, it's the problem with all of these attempts to find that line between protected speech under the First Amendment and speech that is not. But in recent years, there's been a rather ingenious attempt to get around the First Amendment part of pornography. It was started by Catherine McKinnon, who is finishing up at Yale now and starts her tenure chair at the University of Michigan Law School next term, and Andrea Dworkin, who was a radical feminist. What they wanted to do, as McKinnon said once, was to get away from the objections of the First Amendment wimps. They see pornography as something that denigrates women, and it certainly does. And by this denigration, it makes it more difficult for women to be full parts of the polity, of the society. Therefore, according to the model statute they've come up with, this is not a First Amendment question, they say. It's a civil rights question. And she managed to get the Indianapolis City Council to pass a statute. And according to that statute, if a woman walked into a bookstore or a movie or passed a newsstand and found herself offended by the, quote, graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women, whether in pictures or in words, unquote, she'd be able to file a complaint with the city's Office of Equal Opportunity. And in doing so, she'd be filing it not only for herself, but for all women. If a court eventually agreed with her, fines would be imposed on the traffickers, and the offending material would be removed from that city forevermore. The case came up before a district court, federal district court in Indiana, before the first woman federal judge there has ever been in Indiana, Sarah Evans Barker, a Reagan appointee. That was before people around Reagan who were doing these things were really aware of what was going on. I don't think she'd be appointed now, because she's the First Amendment paladin. Then it went up, she knocked it off. She said it was plainly unconstitutional, you can't avoid the First Amendment. Then it went to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Frank Easterbrook wrote the decision. Frank Easterbrook is another Reagan appointee, considered conservative by people on the left. He said, well, if you look at this way of approaching pornography, would the citizens of Indianapolis be deprived by this law of James Joyce's Ulysses? If you remember Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end. What about Homer's Iliad? Both those works depict women as submissive subjects for conquest and domination. We have to watch out, Easterbrook said, for solutions to bad speech that leave the government in control as the great censor and director of which thoughts are good for us. People like McKinnon and Dworkin and a good many other people who do not see themselves as censors, they think they're doing noble work, they always have the illusion, it seems to me, that the people who are going to be doing the deciding which books will get banned, which movies will get banned, that there'll be people like themselves, articulate, sensitive. But it doesn't work that way. The government is not composed entirely of people like that. In fact, many of the magistrates are like the kind of people you get to see behind the counter at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Judge Barker made a very sound point in the course of all of this. She said, if the courts were to allow speech that degrades women to be punished, then other groups offended by magazines, books, television, and movies could well also get ordinance passed covering them. Blacks, Jews, Catholics, unindicted co-conspirators, the handicapped, people whose names end in a vowel. They'd all demand equal protection of the law, and the First Amendment would drown in deserving exceptions. There was also one of the most heartening developments in this whole McKinnon-Dworkin thing, which, by the way, is still going on. They passed it in Bellingham, Washington, toward the end of last year, and it was again thrown out of court. But one of the most heartening things was that as soon as it became clear, after Minneapolis, where they first tried to do this, that these people were serious, and that people were seriously paying attention, and there would be ordinances. In fact, before the Indianapolis statute was knocked out by the Seventh Circuit, there were 12 other cities in the United States ready to adopt this kind of law. what happened was you had another group of feminists called FACT, the Feminist Anti-Censorship Task Force. And they would appear at all the hearings, the legislative hearings, the city council hearings, wherever the other side, Dworkin and McKinnon, wanted to have this way of snuffing out all kinds of books, they would be there with their arguments. And of all the briefs that went to the courts on this, by far the most brilliant was by Nan Hunter, who is now with the American Civil Liberties Union. And one of the things she pointed out was this: the range of feminist imagination and expression in the realm of sexuality has barely begun to find voice. As more women's writing and art on sexual themes emerge, which is unladylike, unfeminine, aggressive, power-charged, pushy, vulgar, urgent, confident, and intense, the traditional enemies of women's attempts to step out of their proper place will find an effective tool of repression in the McKinnon-Dworkin ordinance. There's a parallel movement going on which has so far been much more successful than the McKinnon-Dworkin approach. To me, it's the most dismaying and dangerous attack on freedom of speech, I think since the McCarthy period. Yet it comes not from the right, by no means from the right, neither the religious right or the political right. It comes mostly from liberal students, administrators, and professors, black students, Hispanic students to some extent, though not as much. What I'm talking about is that there are now many, many colleges and universities that have watched a certain degree of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism on campus. That is, graffiti, so-called jokes on the radio, vicious, vulgar notes put into the boxes, for example, of women students at the University of Buffalo Law School. Unquestionably, something has to be done about that. But what they're doing is setting up speech codes, restrictions on speech. You can get punished if you say anything that can be taken as harassing verbally in terms of sexism, racism, disability rights, all that, the whole range of things. Some of the more prestigious colleges in the country have such rules now. Harvard, Stanford, the entire 7-college campus of the University of California. And what struck me, I think the epiphany of all of this for me was, I was going through a whole stack of Stanford University student newspaper material on this. And one letter vigorously supporting the idea of speech codes, of punishing people for what they say, however offensive, was signed by the Afro-American Student Association, the Jewish Student Association, Law School Association, I'm sorry, all these are law schools, African American Jewish Law School Association, and the Asian American Law School Association. From those groups are going to come some of the lawyers and judges of the future. The really dumb part of all this is you don't stop bigotry by trying to suppress the speech. Bigotry thrives in darkness. What ought to be done, and what a few colleges like Yale have done, is you confront and expose what's being said, and you have people talking about this, whatever that was. I know what that was my wife. Unbreakable, like the First Amendment, except I think this is more unbreakable than the First Amendment. It ought to be exposed, and there ought to be a constant dialogue. It's the quick way, and the totally ineffective way, is to punish speech. And the result, among other things, is that people begin, as the president of Stanford, who opposes this stuff, once speech is restricted, is punished, then people are afraid to think aloud in ways that might possibly get them into trouble. There's a brave young man at the University of New York University Law School who, in the school newspaper, the commentator, wrote a letter saying that the place is so full of anti-sexism, anti-racism, anti-everything kind of committees. It's like Castro's Cuba, where you have these people on every block like Madame Defarge, that he said, I finally have decided I'm not going to say anything in class. Because if I say anything against the orthodoxy here, it happens to be the liberal orthodoxy, then I'll get hurt. Who knows what kind of recommendations I'll get. The fact that this is going on and is getting such approval, as I said, from administrators, but also from law professors, especially some of the younger law professors, makes me worried indeed. Going back into school, there was a marvelous case, not so marvelous for the school librarians, it turned out, in Chelsea some years ago. Her name was Sonia Coleman, and she had ordered a book. It was an anthology called Male and Female Under 18. Frank comments from young people about their sex roles today. Kids from all over the country wrote in poems and short stories and sketches and the like. As often happens, one youngster at Chelsea High School took the book home. A parent read a poem in the book and marched down to the office of the school board chairman and said in words that would not go on the FCC today that he wasn't going to spend his tax money on this kind of filth. The poem was by a young woman, I guess she's still a young woman, sure, Jodi Caravaglia, whom I knew at the Village Voice. She was a photographer for us for a while. And the poem is called The City to a Young Girl. The city is 1 million horny, lip-smacking men screaming for my body. The streets are long conveyor belts loaded with these suckling pigs, all begging for a leg, a little pussy, a bit of tit, a leg to rub against, a handful of ass. The connoisseurs of cunt, every day, every night, pressing in on me closer and closer. I swat them off like flies, but they keep coming back. I'm a good piece of meat. As I think is obvious, that's a feminist poem. It was not obvious to the chairman of the school board or to the other members, and there was a lawsuit because Sonia Coleman would not. She was ordered to take all those books out, every anthology that had this poem out of the library, tear out the page, and then put it back on the shelves. There was a trial before federal judge Joseph Taro, a Republican. You really can't categorize these matters. I mean, you can't stereotype them. Joe Taro delivered, I'll only give you a part of it, one of the strongest and I think most lyrical defenses of freedom of speech and thought I've ever seen. One of the things he pointed out is that if this book may be removed by a committee hostile to its language and theme, then the precedent is set for removal of any other work. The prospect of successive school committees sanitizing the school library of views divergent from their own is alarming, whether they do it book by book or one page at a time. He then came to the core of his ruling. What is at stake here is the right to read. By the way, it's interesting, the right to read never appeared in a Supreme Court opinion until Island Trees, when Justice Brennan, writing the majority opinion in a very fragmented decision that has helped no one, except for this, he said there is indeed a right of children and anybody else to read. It's one thing to say that the First Amendment gives you the right to speak, to write, whatever, but that's only part of the circle. If that right exists, then the right to read is a corollary. Anyway, Joe went on to say, the right to read and be exposed to controversial thoughts and language, a valuable right, subject to First Amendment protection. And finally, he talked about why a school library is so vital. I don't know about this town, but in New York City, we have gotten rid of most of the school libraries for cost reasons. And it's a shame. Because I travel around the country to various schools, and there are kids who really do their learning in the school library. And also just do their growing up. Because often this librarian is the one person who has some time, at least, to talk to them. And some of them hang out there, I think, more than they do at home. Anyway, Joe mentioned, I say Joe because I've known him a long time. He's a great jazz aficionado and is a cousin of Tony Pastor, but none of you are old enough to remember the Artie Shaw Band. Anyway, in a library, in a school library, Toro said, a student can literally explore the unknown and discover areas of interest and thought not covered by the prescribed curriculum. The student who discovers the magic of the library is on the way to a lifelong experience of self-education and enrichment. That student learns that a library is a place to test or expand upon ideas presented to him in or out of the classroom. But that only works if the library is not controlled by authoritarian hands, even if those hands belong to members of an elected school committee. The library is violated even if just one poem is excised, said Toro. The book remained in the library. Sonia Coleman received her tenure, although the school committee at first had voted not to give her tenure. Toro threatened them with all kinds of appalling punishments if they didn't give her tenure. But she left the school soon after because, as can happen when those up high don't like you, life was made miserable for her. The postlude to this, while there was a victory for the kids and for the First Amendment, by the way, the kids went to the trial. There were at least 150 kids every day at that trial. It was like a rock concert. But the postlude that is sad is that Sonia did not get another job for many, many years. You know why? She was controversial. You stand up for the First Amendment, that gets you controversial. I'll just leave you with three short things to think about. They're really questions. One is by Richard Kluger, who wrote an excellent book on the New York Herald Tribune called The Paper. He said of the First Amendment, if this singular blessing were not long and well established, it is uncertain as of this writing whether the American people would now authorize its creation. You think about it. I know of very few cities or parts of cities in the United States where the First Amendment as written would pass as written. In most places you would get qualifications. Freedom of speech and press except for pornography, except for obscenity, except for blasphemy, except for anything good to be said about Dan Quayle. It would not pass as it is. Also, there is the use of, I've debated censors, or people who try to censor. In fact, Phyllis Schlafly once wrote me a letter, very annoyed at me because I had called her a censor. And they all say pretty much the same thing. We don't censor book. This is simply a matter of selection. And then I saw this statement by Louis Nell, who was the Deputy Minister for Information in South Africa. We do not have censorship. What we have is a limitation on what newspapers can report. Finally, T.S. Eliot gave an address, the War Memorial Address at Milton Academy in Massachusetts in November 1948. And he said there will always be situations in which one man or woman, I had that, Eliot wasn't thinking in those terms, in which one man or woman or a few men or women will render a service to their society simply by standing alone in an unpopular opinion and telling their countrymen that they are wrong, with no hope of accomplishing anything except witnessing to the truth as they see it. Obviously, we need more people like that. We have precious few as it is. You might try to think of 10 right now. But are we going to get people like that from schools in which they are taught what to think, not how to think? End of sermon. One thing. One of the most extraordinary books in recent years about exactly what T.S. Eliot was talking about, people who stand alone for their convictions. But in this book, they sometimes win. And I think it's a superb book in which to get kids involved in the Constitution and in the Supreme Court, because it's not a textbook. It's called The Courage of Their Convictions. 16 Americans who fought their way to the Supreme Court, by Peter Irons, I-R-O-N-S. It just came out in paperback, Penguin Books. What he does is he takes the case. First, in each case, he has the person speak. So you get the humanity at the core of these Supreme Court decisions, which rarely otherwise gets into the decision, or even the newspaper reporting on it. Then after the person speaks about why he or she did what they did, he then goes over the case and how it came out. And it's all very lucid. Again, it's called The Courage of Their Convictions. It's a superb book. It's almost subversive. Okay. Enunciations, questions, whatever. Can't be all unanimous.